The illness that gave Kyiv a great master. The book that changed the history of several of Kyiv's shrines. Cooperation that gave the world a unique monument of antiquity. Church of Saint Cyril and Athanasius of Alexandria. Its walls observed love and hate, courage and dirty tricks, joy and sorrow. Erected in the first half of the 12th century, robbed and defamed at the beginning of the 13th, resurrected from oblivion by the Ukrainian prince Konstantin Ostrogsky at the beginning of the 17th century, and sent into oblivion by Russian Empress Catherine II at the end of the 18th century. And this is far from being a complete list of the ups and downs that the Kyiv shrine was forced to endure. Each of them left its imprint on the walls of the shrine, whether it is a plus sign or a minus sign. (1880). 34-year-old Adrian Prahov arrives in Kyiv from St. Petersburg. This visit forever changed the history of the city on the river Dnipro and 3 metropolitan shrines. Adrian Viktorovich Prahov, whom Russian publications called the Russian art historian, was born in 1846 in Mstislavl, modern-day Belarus. His father was from a religious family hailing from Vologda region in Russia. His mother was a descendant of the Ukrainian noble Polubinsky family. As a child, Adrian dreamt of becoming a painter, but eye disease prevented him from realizing his childhood dreams. So he ended up enrolling into the Faculty of History and Philosophy of St. Petersburg University. In the capital of the empire, Adrian met prominent Ukrainians, artists Ilya Repin and Mykola Murashko. At the age of 19, he married the 16-year-old illegitimate daughter of the Minister of War Milutin and French national Emilia Maria Clementine Lestel, better known to Ukrainians as Emilia Lvivna Prahova. The girl was beautiful, smart, had many talents. She graduated from the conservatory in piano and took lessons from Liszt himself. At the age of 27, Adrian Prahov received a master's degree and an associate professor position at Petersburg University. At 33, he received a doctorate degree. The following year, after defending his thesis, Adrian Prahov moved to Kyiv, not alone but with his whole family. The 34-year-old man already had 3 children. One of them is Elena, known as Lola in the family. In Kyiv, she would have to live through an exciting love story, a scandal and a painful breakup. And the life of Adrian Viktorovich Prahov was boiling over. He remembered his first trip to Ukraine for the rest of his life. My visit to Kyiv in 1880 was a revelation for me. St. Sophia Cathedral, its wonderful mosaics, it immediately turned my head. It so fascinated me. I was eager to seize all this and to never part from it. Prahov immediately plunged headlong into his work. This summer I devoted to the study of the artistic antiquities of Kyiv, which amazed me with their magnificence. First of all, of course, the priceless mosaics, frescoes, and other antiquities of the St. Sophia Cathedral. The fruit of this study was a whole series of small copies with watercolors and oil paints, which I made with possible accuracy, with the help of photographs and palettes. At first, my work in the Sophia Cathedral had, aside from my personal enlightenment, still correcting some of the blunders in the publication of the Kyiv Sophia Cathedral, undertaken 10 years ago. Mainly the Sophia Eucharist, which is now reprinted by my Russian Archaeological Society, in line with my copy. By the way, such stormy work and arrival in Kyiv after trips to Germany, Novgorod, Uglich, Rostov, Yaroslavl are no accident. The foundation of this visit was laid by one great Ukrainian. In 1861, Adrian Prahov, a 15-year-old teenager at the time, first came across the work of the great poet and artist Taras Shevchenko. Then it was just literary activity. Later there will be work on the pictorial one. Back then, in the May issue of the book Contemporary, Prahov read the poem Haidamaki in its Russian translation. Before that, he read the works of another outstanding Ukrainian, Marko Vovchok, in the original and in the translation by writer Turgenev. The original source impressed him more, so he pinned great hopes on Shevchenko's primary source than on the translation. From that moment on, he became fascinated by the works of the great Kobzar. And at the age of 19, another hobby appeared, that of collecting works of art. So these two hobbies led him to Taras Shevchenko's painting activities. In 1875, a weekly magazine of arts, literature, politics, and public life called Pchela, or Bee, began to appear in St. Petersburg. Its art department was headed by Adrian Prahov, and he began to collect material to highlight the artistic heritage of Taras Shevchenko. In 1876, he published the first article on the paintings of Kobzar, and he became perhaps the first person to discover Shevchenko the painter. No one before him had managed to so thoroughly and comprehensively research Shevchenko's artistic heritage and compare his paintings with his poetry. So it was no surprise that in 1880 he came to the homeland of his beloved Shevchenko. Yes, and it was his own homeland, too. In the same year, he raised before the Imperial Russian Archaeological Society the issue of opening and copying the frescoes inside St. Cyril's church. Society supported the idea of Prahov and even assisted him in obtaining funds, for which the scientist performed the planned works in 1881 to 1882. Adrian Prahov spent the winter of those years traveling around Egypt, Sudan, Palestine, Syria, Greece, and Turkey. In other words, throughout the Christian East. But it was not limited to just cleaning up mosaics and frescoes. The scientist made careful sketches of images he had uncovered. The task I had set myself from the very outset had 3 stages. First, it seemed necessary to me to thoroughly investigate the architectural side, to identify ancient and new parts. Secondly, to open and copy both the 12th century frescoes and all the later layers of painting, if they were actually there. At the same time, it seemed to me necessary to make the copies absolutely magnificent, if possible to the size of the originals, on durable material and with reproduction of all damages, so that these copies could serve as a visual protocol about the condition of a monument at the time of its opening. Finally, the third task was epigraphic, to collect all the inscriptions, both inscribed with a brush in the explanation of the images and all random phrases scrawled in many places around the church, graffiti. Because if collected over the years, chronologically, they would provide interesting material for both the history of the monument and the history of the language, the scientist wrote. He understood very well that with time the mosaics and fresco he had cleared and cleaned up would be corrected and even painted again, so that worshippers would not be offended by the look of a half-erased painting with spoiled figures of saints. He made copies using watercolors and oil painting, using photographs and tracing. But while doing this work, the professor was guided not only by the desire to preserve reliable information about ancient paintings, he also had a personal interest. Good quality copies could bring him considerable success, both in art and in scientific circles. And that's exactly what happened. Thanks to his work in the churches of Kyiv, he gained a reputation as a businessman and a connoisseur of Old Rus and Byzantine art. Even without cleaning up the frescoes in St. Cyril's church right to the end, Adrian Prahov had already presented various reports on this topic. In 1881, at the 5th Archaeological Congress in Tiflis, January 9, 1883, in the Imperial Russian Archaeological Society. The art in this ancient temple was just as necessary for the scientist as he was to art. In January to February of the same 1883, he arranged an exhibition at St. Petersburg University of copies of cleared frescoes from St. Cyril's Church, mosaics and frescoes from St. Sophia Cathedral, mosaics of St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery, and fragments of frescoes of the Desatina Church in Kyiv. There were a total of 202 exhibit pieces. Most of the materials came from St. Cyril's Church, 160 copies. 30 copies were made in St. Sophia Cathedral and 10 at the St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery. 2 more fragments from frescoes in the Desatina Church were provided by archaeologist and pioneer of the foundations of the Desatina Church, Anilinska or St. Elias Church, and the Golden Gate, Kondraty Lochvitsky. He presented it all to the Museum of Antiquities at the University of St. Volodymyr. However, Prahov considered the last copies to be fakes. Copies of the frescoes from the St. Cyril Church were also exhibited in 1884 at the exhibition of the 6th Archaeological Congress in Odessa. And in the summer of 1883, Adrian Prahov headed the restoration crew. As the head of the drawing school, Mykola Murashko recalled, Prahov's charges were to wash the frescoes on the walls, restore them, and to fill empty spaces with new paintings, observing the taste and style of the old images. The crew was made up of artists and teachers of the school of Mykola Murashko, Mykola Pimonenko, Hariton Platonov, Ivan Seleznov, as well as its students Samuil Haiduk, Ivan Yuzhakevich, Valerian Otmar, Alexander Kurinny, Serhiy Kostenko, Viktor Zamirailo, and others. Many of them are well-established artists, but there were also young men and even children who played the role of assistants. In total, there were 30 representatives of the Murashko drawing school. But a year later, unforeseen difficulties arose. The old iconostasis was too high and blocked the ancient frescoes, so Prahov decided to make a new one in Byzantine style. But he did not have the money for the services of a distinguished and established artist. Fearing that in my absence a committee in charge of funds would order some local icon dauber to paint the icons, I took it upon myself to find a talented student of the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg who could perform this task in Kyiv within the bounds of this meagre sum of funds. Having arrived in St. Petersburg in autumn to give lectures at the university, I could not immediately take up this business, the professor recalled. He later turned to his teacher, the famous teacher of drawing and composition of the St. Petersburg Academy, Pavel Petrovich Chistyakov, with a request to recommend him to one of his talented students. Suddenly, a slim, thin young man in a dark suit entered the room in which the conversation was taking place. This was Mikhail Vrubel, a Pole by birth, who'd spent his childhood and adolescence in Ukraine, in Kharkiv and Odessa actually. Chistyakov suggested to Prahov that he look at the work of his student, to make sure the student was really talented. After reviewing his work, Prahov understood he'd found not only a talented, outstanding draftsman, but also a stylist. Adrian Viktorovich Prahov immediately offered the young artist work and named his price, 1,200 rubles for 4 paintings for the iconostasis.